So we're back at the initial conundrum. We don't have a functioning market. We have market failure. So we solved for the problem of market information. We gave the market the information that it needed. But now that we have a perfectly informed market, we have a market characterized by unacceptably high transaction costs, which means we don't have a market. So we're back at the same conundrum that we were before. So the question is, how did the Romans solve then for this transaction cost problem? What did they do in the context of a persistently informationally uncertain market? How did they resolve for this problem and at the same time not engender unacceptably high transaction costs? Competition?
Yeah, competition between merchants, and also I understood through the case that the government was also a little bit involved in the grain trade, since part of the taxes were collected in grain.
This is true. We have our supply. I mean, it might be worth noting for a moment the historical circumstances of the case. We have our supply because farmers operating under the Roman dominion paid their tax in kind. So farmers in Sicily, for example, owed the Roman state every year a certain amount of grain as tax. So that's great. You have your supply. There are these farmers growing grain in the ground, willing to supply grain to Rome as tax in kind. But you need to get it to Rome, don't you? And you need to get it to Rome in a way that has sufficiently low transaction costs that people can still afford it. And that's the problem. So yes, you could have the state imposing price controls, but doesn't that presuppose a functioning market? You can put a price control over something, but if it actually can't get there, who cares? How do we make the market function? What are we solving for? First we solved for informational uncertainty. We solved there, but we found that we solved that problem, but we found that we still ended up with market failure because we have unacceptably high transaction costs. So what's the problem we need to solve for now?
Drive down transaction costs by competition through recording the single transaction.
Okay, we need to drive down transaction costs. One of the ways to do it might be through competition, so you constrain the ability of individual intermediaries to overcharge. So you try and optimize the price mechanism, as we call it. Would that be sufficient, though, given the number of intermediaries that we've pointed out here? We have a farmer, a donkey and cart, we have the village thresher, we have multiple granary owners, we have people who have ships, we have all these different people who are involved in the supply chain. Even if we introduce optimally efficient circumstances in each one of those local transactional environments, would that be sufficient to drive down transaction costs enough to let our hungry Roman have his morning bread?
So, kind of vertically integrated in a way, like creating companies.
Vertical integration, yes. What do we call vertical integration? What's the word for it? A company, a firm, right? What is a firm? Has anyone asked you this question? Have you ever thought about what a firm actually is? What's the firm there for? Has anyone asked you this question yet? Have you pondered this? Does it keep you awake at night? Do you wake up in the morning thinking, good heavens, what's the firm for? Well, in 1937, there was a very famous scholar named Ronald Coase who asked himself that question. He asked himself, why does a firm exist? He wrote a very famous article. It's been cited tens of thousands of times, entitled The Nature of the Firm. And he asked himself that question, why does a firm exist? And the answer that he came up with, now we call it the transactional theory of the firm. The firm is merely an organizationally efficient response to a market transaction problem. So when you have a market, the cost of using of which is high, so there's a high cost of using the market, organizing operations through a firm, coordinating the activities of all those entrepreneurs under the umbrella of the firm, allows you systematically to reduce the transaction costs of that market. It is cheaper to put your donkey and cart man on salary and have them go around and collect the surplus grain than it is to pay them individually every single time that there's a transaction. Simply systematically reduces the cost. And so Coase made this argument, and it's become pretty orthodox, it's dominant theory, that at a very basic level, a firm is merely then an organizational response to a transaction cost problem. And our case in Rome, I think, illustrates that very clearly, because that's what the Romans did. That's why they developed essentially a firm-driven response to using the market. Entrepreneurial-driven response to using the market leads to unacceptably high transaction costs. When you move it to a firm, so that is to say when you domesticate many of those transactions under the umbrella of a single organization, you create efficiencies. It becomes cheaper, and that reduces the overall cost of using the market. And I have a number for you, actually, in the case of Rome. It's quite remarkable. it was estimated that the additional cost of moving grain from, I believe it was Spain, to Rome, so that is to say all of the attendant costs of the supply chain, added only 16% to the cost of the product. Which, if we think about the time period, is a pretty remarkable achievement, to be able to reduce the cost of using the market to only 16% of the value of the good. So that's what we see the Romans doing. They solve for this problem of transaction costs by using a firm-driven response. But that's not an obvious response, is it? If it were an obvious response, firms would be around with us all the time. But we think of the firm as essentially a modern invention. So the question then is, how were the Romans able to derive a firm-driven response? What was it that they had? What could they do that allowed them to use the firm as an efficient response to this market dilemma? And as we know, the problem with a firm is what? What happens as soon as you have a firm? You may get transactional cost efficiencies, but you get it at the expense of something else. What do we call that? Bureaucracy? What?
Moral hazard.
Moral hazard? Well, moral hazard on the part of who? What's the problem of a firm?
The difference between the owners and the people who are executing?
Yeah, the divergence of interest between the people who own the company or supply the capital and the interests of the people who are charged with going out and generating the rents that capital is seeking. In other words, the people who want the profits and the people who have to go make the profits, right? Known in the literature as the principal agent problem. In a very broad way, we might simply say that a firm is merely a principal agent problem that has been more or less effectively solved. But it's a very serious problem, right? The principal agent problem. Because if I give somebody a whole bunch of money and I send them out and they go 1,000 kilometers away to act on my behalf, and I have no idea what they're doing, am I likely to lend them money in the first place? Am I likely to capitalize the system in the first place? No. What's the precondition for capitalization? Knowing something about the returns that your capital is going to generate. And if you don't have any confidence in the agency that's generating those returns, are you likely to move capital into that market in the first place? No. And yet, Rome was a city of 1 million people for 500 years in a persistently informationally uncertain environment, which means that they must have had a well-capitalized market, a well-functioning market. How was it that they were able to resolve for the principal agent problem of the firm in order to generate the capital that the market needed to function?